The Emperor crowns heroes, but keeps only executioners. Leman Russ was not born to save mankind. He was bred to end it. His howl carried no mercy, only the silence of obedience. And in that silence, the galaxy learned that loyalty is just another word for death. The Imperium does not remember its heroes with kindness. Even the most loyal of the Emperor's sons are remembered through whispers of fear, through tales that shudder across the millennia, like cracks in the bedrock of a dying world. Among them stands one figure whose shadow is not merely long, but eternal. He is not cherished as a savior, nor remembered as a builder. His name carries the taste of blood and the stench of burning cities. He is Leman Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris, the Emperor's executioner. Where others forged empires, Russ was forged to end them. He was the hand raised high, ready to strike down brother and foe alike until only silence remained. His beginning lies shrouded in the same nightmare as all Primarchs, a scattering across the stars, caused by the treachery of beings who sought to unmake the Emperor's grand design. The child who would become Leman Russ did not awaken to scholars or kings. He did not grow in the arms of a nurturing civilization, but upon the frozen death world of Fenris. Here, the air itself was cruel. Seas of ice rose and fell with murderous tides. Predators prowled across wastes of permafrost, and humanity clung to survival like vermin. Fenris was not a world meant to foster enlightenment. It was a crucible that devoured the weak and forged only monsters strong enough to outlast their kin. From this crucible, Russ emerged not as a boy, but as a wolf. The legends say he was raised by the great wolves of Fenris, half-mythic beasts with fangs that could shear steel and hides as thick as fortress walls. These were not the gentle wolves of lost Terra's folklore. They were nightmares of ice and hunger, towering predators whose existence demanded reverence. In their company, Russ learned the law of survival: strength without hesitation, loyalty without question, death without remorse. By the time wandering tribes of men found him, the boy was no boy at all, but a creature more wolf than human, whose eyes glowed like amber fire, and whose voice growled with the echo of Fenris's howling storms. He rose swiftly among them. In a world where strength was the only truth, Russ was the truest of all. He shattered warriors in single combat, wrestled beasts that had devoured villages, and feasted upon the spoils of endless conquest. The sagas of Fenris swelled with his deeds, their songs echoing across frozen fjords and mead halls lit by fire and blood. By the time the Emperor arrived upon Fenris, Russ was already more legend than man, worshipped as a demigod by tribes who saw in him the incarnation of their gods of war and winter. But Russ was not a god. He was something far more dangerous, a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. When the Emperor descended, clad in gold and radiance, he did not meet a child to be guided, but a warrior king, unwilling to bow. Russ challenged him, as Fenris demanded all men challenge those who would rule them. They fought as storm and flame clashed in the mead halls of Russ's hall. For a day and night, the duel raged, Russ with fang and claw, the Emperor with the infinite might of his design. It ended not with the breaking of Russ, but with laughter. For in Russ, the Emperor saw the instrument he required, not a philosopher, not a statesman, but the edge of his own wrath, tempered in the cold of Fenris and unflinching in its savagery. Leman Russ bent the knee, not out of defeat, but out of recognition. He had found a master worth serving, and the Emperor had found his executioner. Russ was given command of the 6th Legion, the wolves who would bear the mark of Fenris. They were not like the other legions, where the ultramarines built civilizations and the imperial fists raised fortresses. The wolves were unleashed only when destruction was demanded. They were the sanction of the emperor given form, dispatched not to conquer, but to erase. Where whispers of treachery brewed, where compliance faltered and rebellion kindled, the wolves came. And wherever the wolves came, nothing remained. Entire populations were put to the sword, cities burned, histories erased until even memory was ash. The wolves did not simply conquer, they devoured. And at their head, always, was Russ, the Lord of Winter and Ruin. It is said he relished the role, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. For Russ believed in no illusions. He saw mankind not as noble or enlightened, but as fragile, desperate beasts gnawing at one another for survival. To him, order could only be forged by fear, and fear could only be sustained through punishment. In his eyes, the Emperor was not merely the father of mankind, but its necessary tyrant. And Russ, his chosen son, was the fangs and claws that ensured obedience. Yet there is a cruelty in such a role that corrodes all it touches. The wolves were never loved, never welcomed. Other legions spoke of them in hushed voices, with mistrust and contempt. They were called the executioners, the emperor's butchers, mongrels cloaked in the pretense of loyalty. And still, the wolves obeyed. For obedience was their oath, and Russ their unflinching lord. Every legion could dream of glory. The wolves had only duty. They drank from cups filled with blood and silence, and in every hall they feasted. There hung the stench of those they had slaughtered in the emperor's name. Haunting reflection spread across the Imperium like a wound that would never close. Wherever Russ walked, he carried with him not only the loyalty of Fenris, but also the unyielding weight of his purpose. For he knew, and all who watched him knew, that his bond with his brothers was poisoned from the start. While others could hope to be remembered as conquerors, saints, or martyrs, Russ would always be remembered as the hand that struck down his own kin. Even before betrayal tore the galaxy apart, the wolves were already hated. Even before the heresy, Russ was already the Emperor's executioner. And in that role, he would find no redemption. The Great Crusade did not forgive hesitation, nor did it tolerate weakness. As the Emperor's armies swept across the stars, entire civilizations bent beneath the weight of compliance, or were ground into dust beneath the boots of the legions. Yet even among that storm of conquest, the wolves of Fenris were different. When the Emperor sent forth his executioners, it was not to spread the ideals of his vision, but to extinguish them in blood. Other Primarchs could posture as rulers and lawmakers, cloaking their wars in the guise of enlightenment. Leman Russ never indulged in such illusions. He was dispatched to worlds deemed irredeemable, societies too steeped in heresy or pride to bow willingly. Where diplomacy failed, Russ did not parley. He unleashed the wolves. The campaigns of the 6th Legion carved scars across the stars. On the world of Dulan, the tyrant kings mocked the Imperium's call for compliance, their arrogance shielded by armies and the promise of ancient oaths. Russ responded not with siegecraft or patient negotiation, but with annihilation. He hurled his warriors into the enemy's strongholds with a ferocity that even his brother legions could scarcely comprehend. Cities fell in days. Their people hunted through smoke and ruin like prey across the ice fields of Fenris. The Dulan kings were dragged from their halls and broken like cattle beneath the fang. By the campaign's end, the world lay silent, its history scoured by fire. The Emperor's decree had been fulfilled, and in the silence that followed, Russ's name became a curse whispered by those who still dared resist the Imperium's hand. Other legions saw this and recoiled. Leman, the statesman of Ultramar, who dreamed of building a rational empire, spoke of the wolves with unease. Dorn, the unyielding fortress master, questioned the savagery of their methods. Even Horus, once closest of brothers to Russ, muttered that the wolves destroyed too much, too quickly, leaving little for others to claim. But none of their doubts mattered, for the Emperor himself had sanctioned Russ. When he spoke of the wolves, he did not call them legionnaires. He called them his executioners. And in those words lay the fate of Russ forever. The name clung to him like chains, and he bore them without flinching. For Russ understood that the wolves were not meant to be loved. They were meant to be feared. The Emperor had crafted each son with purpose, and his was crueler than most. Magnus was made to know the warp, Dorn to build walls, Fulgrim to seek perfection. Russ was born to kill without hesitation, to strike at brothers when commanded, to be the reminder that the Emperor's will could never be defied. In his veins flowed not the promise of glory, but the certainty of blood. And though it hollowed him, though it set him apart from all others, he embraced it as truth. The Wolf King never lied to himself about what he was. Across countless worlds, the wolves earned their reputation. Their war howls echoed across battlefields like the storms of Fenris, their packs descending upon defenders with fang and blade. They tore through lines with merciless precision, their fury untempered by pity or restraint. They fought not as soldiers, but as predators, coordinated yet feral, reveling in the kill even as they carried out the Emperor's justice. And behind them, Leman Russ stood unyielding, his eyes like the northern lights of Fenris, casting judgment without mercy. To follow Russ was to walk in the shadow of extinction, for where he marched, survival was rare and absolution impossible. But such roles carry with them poison. Within the Imperium's heart, whispers grew. Some called the wolves abominations, their savagery a stain upon the dream of unity. Others muttered that the Emperor kept them close, only to remind the other Primarchs of his leash, that the wolves existed not to conquer enemies, but to punish brothers. And there was truth in this, for already Russ had been used not merely against alien foes, but against human worlds where resistance burned too bright. His legion was the blade held over the Imperium itself, a warning to all who might one day falter. He was not just the Emperor's weapon, he was his threat made flesh. The weight of this role was not lost upon Russ. In the solitude of his mead halls aboard the flagship Hrafnkel, he drank in silence while the howls of his legion filled the void beyond. His warriors celebrated victories, yet Russ sat apart, his mind locked upon the path carved for him. He did not envy Leman his empire, nor Dorn his bastions, nor even Horus his favored place at the Emperor's side. For Russ had seen what they had not. He understood the truth of the Imperium. It was not a dream of progress, but a reign of terror, and he was its darkest instrument. There were times when he raged against it. Fenris burned in his heart as a reminder of loyalty and pack bond, of simple truths stripped of politics. He longed for a galaxy where brotherhood was not poisoned by suspicion, where loyalty was not tested with executions. Yet each time he raised his eyes, he saw the Emperor's will reflected in every order, and so he obeyed. He always obeyed. For if Russ was anything, he was loyal. Loyal not to the dream of humanity, but to the master who had tamed him. It was this loyalty that set him apart, even as it damned him. His brothers could cloak themselves in visions of freedom, or twist the Emperor's word to suit their ambitions. Russ could not. He saw himself as the Emperor's beast, bound by oath and blood. And when the day came that his father would call upon him to slay his kin, Russ knew, without hesitation, that he would obey, for that was why he had been created, to hunt, to kill, to end what others began. He bore that burden so others could claim innocence. The shadow of this truth grew longer with every campaign. The wolves tore through Xenos strongholds, crushed human rebellions, and drowned worlds in blood. Yet even as victory was declared, Russ felt the eyes of his brothers upon him. Distrust sharpened into fear, fear into hatred. They saw in him not a comrade, but a sentence waiting to fall. And perhaps they were right, for Russ himself admitted as much. He did not deny the role. He embraced it, even as it consumed him, for he would rather be hated for obedience than loved for betrayal. In the cold halls of Fenris, the Skalds still sing of their Wolf King, of the feasts and victories, of the hunts across ice and fire. But beneath the songs lies a darker truth. For those same halls echo with silence, the silence of a people who know their Lord was not made for glory, but for murder. Fenris bred killers, and the Emperor shaped their greatest son into the perfect one. The Wolf King had become the executioner. It is said that every howl of the wolves carried a hidden lament, not for themselves, but for those they would one day be ordered to kill. For Russ knew, as only he could know, that his true prey would not be tyrants or aliens. His prey would be his own blood. The bonds of brotherhood among the Primarchs were never equal. Each was shaped to embody an aspect of the Emperor's vision, yet each saw in the others a reflection of their own fears and ambitions. For Leman Russ, this bond was poisoned from the beginning. He was not the statesman, nor the philosopher, nor the beloved warlord. He was the sanction. His brothers knew it, even if they rarely spoke it aloud. They would drink with him, laugh with him, test their strength in contests of arms, but behind their smiles lay unease. For in the Wolf King they saw the leash of their father, the warning that obedience was never optional. They might call him brother, but in their hearts they knew him as the Emperor's executioner. Among them all, his relationship with Horus burned brightest and darkest. In the days before the heresy, the two were close. Horus admired Russ's ferocity, his loyalty, the unshakable simplicity of his truth. Russ, in turn, found in Horus a kind of kinship he rarely knew. Horus was the favored son, the war master who carried the Emperor's authority across the stars. Yet he was also a warrior who laughed loud, fought hard, and treated Russ not as an animal on a leash, but as an equal. Together, they waged campaigns that shattered worlds, their legions moving in brutal harmony. To witness them was to see fire and storm unleashed, each amplifying the other's wrath until nothing remained but ruin. But even in that bond, shadows crept. For Russ could never forget what he was, and Horus could never forget what Russ had been made to do. Their friendship was real, their brotherhood genuine, yet both understood it was fragile. When the Emperor turned his gaze, Russ would be the one to strike, and Horus would be the one to fall. That knowledge lingered unspoken between them, a truth neither wished to face. Yet it poisoned every feast, every toast, every memory they shared. With Magnus of Prospero, the strain was worse still. Where Russ was fangs and fury, Magnus was knowledge and power drawn from the Imperium. The Wolf King despised sorcery, not out of ignorance but out of understanding. He knew what it was to be ruled by forces larger than oneself, to be enslaved to a will beyond reason. The warp was not a tool in his eyes, but a predator, hungering to consume all. and so he hated Magnus's reliance on it, hated the arrogance with which his red-skinned brother cloaked himself. Russ did not see wisdom in Magnus's pursuit of truth. He saw weakness, the kind of weakness that would one day demand the bite of the executioner's axe. Their contempt for one another was legend. On campaign, their legions clashed as often as they cooperated, Russ's warriors mocking the Thousand Sons as witches, while Magnus's sons scorned the wolves as beasts. The Emperor tolerated their rivalry, perhaps even nurtured it, for he knew what he had made. He knew that one day, one brother would be needed to end the other, and Russ, in his heart, knew it too. The executioner always knows his prey before the hunt begins. With others, the mistrust was subtler. Leman spoke often of the wolves as a liability, their savagery unsuited for the Imperium's greater order. Russ mocked him in return, deriding the sterile perfection of Ultramar as a hollow dream. Dorn respected Russ's strength, but distrusted his methods, while Fulgrim sneered at his barbarism, unable to comprehend a man who cared nothing for beauty or refinement. Even those who admired Russ, Jagatai for his freedom, Vulcan for his loyalty, did so with caution. They all knew the truth. The wolves could be turned against them at any time. Their loyalty was not to brothers, but to the Emperor alone. The Emperor did nothing to ease this distrust. In council, when the Primarchs gathered, he spoke openly of Russ's role. "The wolves are my sanction," he declared once, his voice echoing like thunder. "They exist to end what must be ended." No clarification, no veil of tact, only the truth spoken plainly. And in that truth, every Primarch heard a sentence. Russ did not flinch when his father said those words. He drank them in like bitter mead, another reminder of what he was. But his brothers did flinch. They looked upon him and saw the blade above their necks. It was no wonder they despised him. No wonder they spoke his name with caution. For Russ was not just their brother. He was their doom waiting in silence. In the mead halls of Fenris, the Skalds sang of loyalty, of honor, of bonds unbroken by distance or blood. Yet Russ himself carried none of these illusions. He loved his brothers in his own way, but he never deluded himself that love would protect them. He knew that when the Emperor commanded, he would kill them without hesitation. That was why he was made. That was why he lived. And so, when others dreamed of unity, Russ prepared himself for betrayal. For only the executioner knows that loyalty is never eternal, and that every bond eventually rots. This grim understanding left its mark upon his legion. The wolves were loyal, but their loyalty mirrored their lords. They did not fight for brotherhood or unity. They fought for obedience. They were a legion always waiting for the command to turn, to strike down those who had once been allies. This knowledge isolated them. Other legions drank together, celebrated victories, forged bonds across campaigns. The wolves remained apart, their howls echoing across the void like warnings. They were not part of the dream of empire. They were its shadow, stalking the dream until the moment came to tear it down. And so the seeds of the future were sown long before the heresy. Russ's bond with Horus, poisoned by the knowledge of what he might one day do. His rivalry with Magnus, destined to end in flames. His mistrust with Leman and Dorn, never healed. His contempt for Fulgrim, never softened. Each relationship was already a wound, festering beneath the surface, waiting for the day it would be torn open. Russ carried these wounds like trophies, not with pride, but with inevitability. He did not ask for healing. He only waited for the Emperor to decide when the cutting would begin. haunting reflection spread through the Imperium. Loyalty itself was a weapon, and Russ was proof of it. His loyalty was pure, unshakable, unyielding. But it was not a shield. It was a knife. For in his hands, loyalty was sharpened into death, ready to be used against any who faltered. And though the Imperium marched onward in triumph, conquering world after world, the shadow of that knife lingered over every feast, every council, every brother's embrace. They knew it was only a matter of time before the blade fell, and Leman Russ, the Wolf King, knew he would be the one to bring it down. The Great Crusade pressed on like an endless tide, sweeping across the galaxy with banners of compliance raised high above seas of corpses. And wherever rebellion was too deep-rooted, wherever resistance was judged too corrupt to be reshaped, the wolves of Fenris were sent to bring silence. It was in these long, bloody years that Russ's role hardened into something unshakable. He was not merely a warlord, not merely a primarch. He was the Emperor's sanction, the one who ended debates with executions and silenced dreams with fire. Worlds that had survived for millennia vanished beneath his wrath in the span of months. Their names faded from the records, their cultures erased, their people slaughtered or scattered. Only the silence of obedience remained. And in that silence, Russ heard the echo of his destiny. Yet in the Emperor's service, it was not only worlds of strangers that awaited his judgment. His brothers, the other sons of the Master of Mankind, were never beyond suspicion. Each had been crafted to embody strength, yet each harbored flaws that festered like wounds left untreated. And when those flaws threatened the Imperium's fragile unity, Russ was called to remind them what loyalty truly cost. He did not relish these roles, but he did not refuse them either. He was the executioner, and when the blade was needed, he obeyed. The first of these duties came at Dulan. The campaign had begun under the authority of the War Master himself. The tyrant kings of that world defied the Imperium with pride, hurling back emissaries and mocking the promise of unity. Horus had been tasked with their destruction, but it was Russ who struck the final blow. When the tyrant was dragged screaming from his fortress, Horus wished to make of him a lesson, to break him in public as an example of the Imperium's might. Russ disagreed. There was no lesson in mercy, no wisdom in leaving the enemy alive long enough to speak. And so, before Horus could act, Russ killed the tyrant outright, tearing victory from his brother's hands with a single brutal act. The lesson was delivered not to the foe, but to Horus himself. When the wolves were unleashed, they answered to no vision but the Emperor's will. Their role was not to demonstrate power, it was to end life. Horus never forgot that insult. Their bond, though repaired in words and gestures, carried a scar from that day forward. The War Master knew then what Russ truly was, not a brother who stood beside him, but the blade that could be turned against him without warning. And Russ, in his own way, accepted this. Bonds were fragile. Duty was eternal. That was the truth of his existence. But it was with Magnus that Russ's role would reach its most infamous expression. The Wolf King and the Crimson King had despised one another since their first meeting. Where Russ was blunt, Magnus was secretive. Where Russ trusted in fang and claw, Magnus trusted in sorcery. The wolves saw witchcraft as corruption, the howling of predators in the warp that no man could ever hope to tame. To Russ, the Thousand Sons were already lost, their fate written the moment Magnus drew upon the warp as one might draw breath. Their rivalry grew with every campaign, every council, every debate. Words sharpened into threats, and threats into bloodied clashes between their legions. And always the Emperor allowed it. always he let the enmity grow. For he knew what was coming. He had seen it, as he had seen so much. Magnus's arrogance would one day tear open a wound too deep to heal. And when that day came, only Russ could end it. The Emperor's sanction could not be Leman, who would seek compromise, nor Dorn, who would build prisons rather than graves. It could not be Horus, whose ambition made him suspect, nor Sanguinius, whose compassion would hesitate. It could only be Russ, who knew no hesitation, who knew no mercy, who understood that loyalty meant nothing if it was not enforced with death. Only the Wolf King could burn Prospero. The seeds were sown long before that final order. Magnus's warnings about the warp were dismissed as arrogance, his pleas for understanding regarded as excuses. He was brilliant, yes, but brilliance was a thin shield against the truth of corruption. Russ saw the Thousand Sons as a legion of corpses waiting to fall, their sorcery gnawing at the Imperium's heart like rot beneath gilded armor. When Magnus called upon the warp to defy the Emperor's decree, to breach the sanctum of Terra itself in a desperate attempt at warning, Russ knew that the moment had come. The executioner's blade would fall upon his brother, not upon strangers. But betrayal is not always clean, and Russ's own path to Prospero was twisted by deceit. Horus, already poisoned by the whispers of the warp, saw in this order a chance to break both Russ and Magnus. He twisted the Emperor's command, turning punishment into annihilation. The wolves were not sent to censure, but to destroy. The Wolf King obeyed, believing his father had commanded him to burn Prospero to ash. He descended upon the city of Tizca with fang and fire, and the wolves howled as they tore apart the shining works of Magnus's sons. Towers fell, libraries burned, warriors were hunted through the streets like prey beneath Fenrisian moons. It was not justice, it was massacre, and yet Russ did not falter. Even as Magnus himself stood against him, even as the Crimson King's wrath tore through his warriors with sorcery no mortal could match, Russ pressed onward. Brother fought brother, not for victory, but for extermination. In that ruin, the truth of Russ's role was laid bare for all to see. He was not a conqueror, not a ruler, not a savior. He was the executioner, and his prey had always been his kin. What followed scarred Russ forever. Prospero burned, and though Magnus escaped into the warp, his legion was shattered. The wolves had fulfilled their duty, but the echoes of their howls were not triumph. They were mourning, for even the fiercest predator knows the taste of ash when it devours its own blood. Russ returned to his mead hall in silence, the laughter gone from his voice, the fire dimmed in his eyes. He had done what he was made to do, and in doing it, he had proved what all his brothers had always feared. None of them were safe from the Wolf King. None of them were safe from the Emperor's will. Haunting reflection spread across the galaxy. Brotherhood was a lie. Blood was no shield. In the end, loyalty demanded only one thing: that when ordered, one must kill those they love most. Leman Russ had shown that truth in fire and ruin, and the galaxy would never forget it. That concludes Part 4, approximately 1,090 words. Would you like me to continue into Part 5, covering the aftermath of Prospero, Russ's isolation from his brothers, and how the heresy finally turned the executioner's blade upon the Imperium itself? The ashes of Prospero clung to Russ long after the fires died. He returned to the Imperium not as a conquering son, but as a pariah, his name spoken in silence and his presence met with guarded eyes. The other Primarchs did not openly condemn him, for none would dare challenge the Emperor's command, but their mistrust had solidified into hatred. To them, Russ was no longer simply the Wolf King of Fenris. He was the reminder that no matter how great their deeds, no matter how deep their bonds, the Emperor could order their destruction with a single word, and Russ would be the hand to carry it out. His loyalty, once admired, had become a weapon that cast its shadow over all. Russ himself bore this burden with the stoicism of a predator who knows his role in the hunt. He did not apologize for Prospero. He did not seek forgiveness from Magnus, nor pity from his brothers. He had obeyed. That was the only truth he recognized. Yet beneath that iron obedience, even the Wolf King was not unscarred, for he knew in the silence of his halls that something vital had been torn away from him on Prospero. He had slain not merely a brother, but a fragment of his own humanity, and once lost, such things cannot be reclaimed. The wolves, too, bore the mark of that slaughter. They had always been feared, but now they were despised. Other legions spoke of them as murderers, kinslayers, creatures who had no place among brothers. Their howls, once battle cries that inspired dread in enemies, now carried an echo of shame. They had fulfilled their role as executioners, but in doing so, they had lost whatever fragile claim they might have had to kinship among the legions. They became more isolated than ever, retreating into the company of their own kind, bound only to their Wolf King and to Fenris. They had no friends, only prey. It was in this state of isolation that the heresy erupted. Horus, once the favored son, once the brother Russ had called friend, turned his blade against the Emperor and plunged the galaxy into fire. Worlds that had sworn obedience burned in rebellion, legions split apart, and the dream of unity shattered into ruin. The wolves found themselves drawn into the maelstrom, but their role was unlike that of any other. They were not merely to fight traitors. They were to remind all of what it meant to betray. They were to be the fangs that sank deep into the throat of the Imperium's enemies, even as those enemies bore the faces of men they had once feasted with. Russ's hatred for Horus was sharp and bitter, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. The wound of Dulan, the scar of Prospero, all had prepared him for this moment. He had always known betrayal would come, and now it had. The War Master's treachery was no surprise, only its scale. To Russ, the galaxy's fall into civil war was not a shocking collapse, but a confirmation of what he had always believed, that brotherhood was fragile, that loyalty was brittle, and that only the Emperor's sanction could bind men together. The heresy did not change Russ, it vindicated him. The wolves fought with savage fury against the traitor hosts, hurling themselves into battles where other legions faltered. They did not fight for glory, nor even for the Emperor's dream. They fought for the command given, for the oath sworn. Their howls echoed across worlds drowned in the madness of war, tearing apart traitors and heretics with the same ferocity they had once unleashed upon Prospero. They hunted across void and ruin, each battle another confirmation of their place in the Emperor's design. They were not saviors, they were executioners, and in a galaxy aflame, execution was all that remained. Yet the heresy brought with it more than war. It brought reflection, and in that reflection, Russ found no solace. He remembered Horus as a brother, remembered their feasts and laughter, remembered the warmth of camaraderie that had been rare in his life, and he knew that it had all been ash from the beginning. He remembered Magnus, broken and burning on Prospero, and wondered if, in his own way, Magnus had seen more clearly than any of them. For Magnus had warned of the warp, had cried out against the Emperor's secrets, and in return had been silenced with fang and fire. Russ had done his duty, Yet now the galaxy paid the price for that silence. And though he would never admit it aloud, the Wolf King knew that he too bore a fragment of blame. Still, he did not waver. Doubt could gnaw at his heart, but it could not slow his hand. Russ did what he had always done. He obeyed. He fought at the head of his wolves, hunting traitors with unrelenting ferocity. On world after world, his legion left only ruin behind, their fury a warning to all who still hesitated. For in the heresy, hesitation was death, and the executioner had no patience for delay. The wolves became a terror not only to the traitors, but to the wavering loyalists, a reminder that loyalty was not a choice, but a command. Those who faltered were dragged down into silence, their screams lost beneath the howling of Fenrisian blades. And yet, amid all this fury, Russ carried within him a silence deeper than any void. He drank alone more often than he celebrated, his laughter rare, his gaze fixed upon something no others could see. For Russ knew that the heresy was not merely a war of armies. It was the inevitable culmination of what the Emperor had always built. It was the truth revealed that sons were made not to be loved, but to be used. That brotherhood was not family, but fuel. And in that truth, Russ recognized himself more clearly than ever. He was not the Wolf King. He was not the hero of Fenris. He was the Emperor's executioner. And the heresy was nothing more than the grand hunt for which he had been bred. The wolves followed him without question, their loyalty mirroring his own. They did not dream of a better future. They did not sing of a lost golden age. They fought because Russ fought, because the Emperor commanded, because their role demanded it. And in their howls, there was no hope, only inevitability. For they knew, as their Lord knew, that there could be no redemption in this war, only slaughter. Haunting reflection spread through the void. In the galaxy's darkest hour, loyalty was indistinguishable from damnation. Russ and his wolves proved this with every battle, every hunt, every corpse left in their wake. They were loyal, yes, but loyalty had never been salvation. It had only ever been another word for death. That concludes Part 5, approximately 1,080 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 6, focusing on Russ's battles during the heresy, his deepening isolation, and the grim realization that the Emperor had always intended him for a fate beyond victory or survival? The galaxy burned, and in that fire, the wolves were unchained. The Horus heresy was not a war of ideals to Leman Russ. It was a hunt, and like all hunts, it demanded blood. The wolves of Fenris became terror given form, their fleets descending upon traitor-held worlds with the inevitability of winter storms. Where other legions sought to reclaim territory, Russ sought only to punish. He cared little for banners planted or borders reclaimed. His task was simpler, darker, more final, to ensure that those who had betrayed the Emperor would not live to betray him again. Every planet cracked beneath his claws was one less ember of rebellion to threaten the Imperium's fragile core. But war, even for an executioner, is not without cost. The wolves were stretched thin, their packs scattered across the stars, hunting in isolation. The heresy was too vast, too consuming, and not even the fury of Fenris could silence it all. The wolves bled, their numbers dwindling, their howls less thunderous than before. For every traitor they cast down, another rose elsewhere, and Russ knew the truth. His role was not to end the heresy, but to endure it. He was not made for victory. He was made to carry the weight of obedience until obedience itself became unbearable. The strain of loyalty tore deeper with each passing year. Russ watched as his brothers turned, one by one, their pride and ambition rotting into treachery. Fulgrim, once obsessed with beauty, twisted into a demon of excess. Angron, the gladiator, unleashed his rage upon the stars. Mortarion, the stoic reaper, surrendered himself to decay. Horus, the war master, dragged half their kin into damnation. Even Magnus, broken and banished, had chosen his path. To Russ, none of this was unexpected. He had seen it from the start. They were all flawed, all fragile, all destined for betrayal. Yet knowing this did not make the truth easier to bear. For each brother lost, each legion turned, was another wound carved into his soul, and still he obeyed. For Russ could not do otherwise. The wolves themselves whispered of his silence. Their lord, once loud in feast and fierce in laughter, grew quiet. His eyes, once alight with the storms of Fenris, dimmed with something colder. He gave orders, he led hunts, but he no longer joined his sons in their revels. He drank alone, staring into cups of mead as though searching for answers at the bottom. His warriors loved him still, but they felt the weight pressing upon him, the inevitability of his role closing around them all. For the wolves had no illusions. They were not here to win glory. They were here to kill until there was nothing left to kill, and then to be hated for it. In the midst of this bleak crusade, Russ faced his greatest trial during the heresy. It was not on Prospero, nor in the ruins of some nameless world, but in the meeting of brother against brother once more. Horus, swollen with the corruption of the warp, sought to shatter the wolves utterly. He unleashed his legions against them in a storm of fire and blood, determined to erase the executioner from the galaxy. The battle was a massacre, fought across void-shattered fields and blood-soaked ground. The wolves howled with fury, but they were outnumbered, outmatched, drowning beneath the tide of traitor steel. In that chaos, Russ and Horus met again. Once, they had been friends. Once, they had laughed and feasted together. Now, they stood as predator and prey. Horus, the War Master, twisted by powers Russ despised, faced the Wolf King with the arrogance of a god. Russ met him not with arrogance, but with inevitability. Their clash was titanic, shaking the battlefield with every blow, fangs and claws against the blade of betrayal. For a time, they were evenly matched, but the warp's poison lent Horus strength, and Russ faltered beneath its weight. Wounded, broken, bleeding, the Wolf King fell. Yet even in his fall, he did not submit. He spat blood into Horus's face and laughed, a broken, defiant sound that carried the truth of Fenris, that winter does not yield even in death. Horus left him broken, believing him finished, but Russ did not die. He crawled from that ruin, torn and shattered, carried by his wolves into the void. His wounds would never heal fully, his body forever scarred by that duel. But he lived, and in that survival, he carried with him the bitter knowledge that he had failed, not because he had been defeated, but because he had lived. The executioner was not allowed the mercy of death. He was condemned to endure. The wolves rebuilt what they could, though their numbers were decimated. They became more insular than ever, bound only to their lord, mistrusted even by those who still called themselves loyalists. In the councils of war, Russ was silent, his voice heavy with wounds both physical and unseen. He knew the heresy would not end with him, nor with the wolves. It would burn until Terra itself was at stake, and then the Emperor would demand one final sacrifice. And Russ, though scarred, though broken, though weary beyond measure, would obey, for he could not be anything else. This realization hardened into fatalism. Russ no longer spoke of victory, nor even of loyalty. He spoke only of necessity. The wolves fought not because they believed, but because they must. They killed not because they hated, but because they were ordered. Their war had become pure obedience, stripped of even the pretense of purpose, and in that hollow obedience, Russ saw the truth of the Imperium laid bare. It was never about dreams. It was never about unity. It was only about survival through fear and blood, and he, the Emperor's executioner, was the embodiment of that truth. The haunting reflection spread among those who still whispered of him. Russ had faced Horus and survived, but survival was not triumph. Survival was damnation. His wounds marked him not as a hero, but as a relic of inevitability. The Wolf King, scarred and broken, was still alive because the Emperor's will demanded it. And as long as he lived, the blade of the executioner still hung over every soul in the Imperium. That concludes Part 6, approximately 1,090 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 7, covering Russ's return after his wounding, his grim role as the heresy reached Terra, and the realization that the wolves were never meant to rebuild, only to die, fulfilling their duty? Russ returned from his wounding as something less than a man and more than a monster. The duel with Horus had left his body broken, his ribs shattered, his flesh scarred with wounds that would never fully close. But deeper still were the fractures carved into his spirit. He had looked upon his brother in the fullness of corruption, had fought him not as a man but as a creature swollen with the warp's gifts. He had seen, in those eyes, what loyalty twisted into betrayal truly looked like. And he knew then that the Emperor had not given him life to prevent such things, but to endure them. For no matter how strong the executioner's blade, corruption would rise again, and again the blade would be needed. Russ had not failed by losing to Horus. He had failed by living to see that truth. His wolves bore him back to Fenris, carrying their lord like hunters dragging home a wounded beast. There he healed as best he could, but healing was a lie. The Wolf King limped from that day onward, his breath heavy, his frame scarred. His laughter, once thunderous, was rare. Even in the halls of his great fortress monastery, where mead flowed and fires burned, he sat apart, a shadow among his sons. They saw his silence and mirrored it, becoming more feral, more inward. The Legion had been broken with him, and though they still fought, it was with the grim fatalism of men who knew their deaths were already written, and still the heresy raged. Word reached Fenris of the War Master's march upon Terra, of the walls of the Imperial Palace trembling beneath the weight of traitor guns, of brothers tearing one another apart in the shadow of the throne. The wolves were called once more to war. Wounded or not, broken or not, Russ obeyed. He gathered what remained of his legion and hurled them into the void, their ships bloodied but unyielding, their howls echoing through the warp as they answered the Emperor's summons. For no wound could excuse disobedience, no scar could erase duty. The executioner always answers the call. They did not arrive in time to witness the final duel upon Terra, when Horus met the Emperor and fell, nor did they carve their mark into the siege that ended the dream of unity. By the time the wolves drew close, the deed was done. The Emperor was broken upon the golden throne, Horus's body destroyed, and the traitor legions scattered into the void. Russ had marched to the greatest hunt in history, only to arrive when the prey was already slain. Yet this absence did not save him from the weight of what had happened. If anything, it deepened his burden. For Russ understood that had he stood upon Terra, he would not have been the one to face Horus in that final battle. He would have been ordered to watch, to hold the blade over his surviving brothers, to ensure obedience in victory. even at the heart of the galaxy's greatest war, Russ's place would never have been triumph. It would always have been sanction. The aftermath of the heresy was no peace. The wolves, like all the shattered legions, were ordered to retreat, to break themselves down, to scatter into smaller hosts. Leman spoke of rebuilding, of reforging the Imperium into something that might survive. Dorn spoke of vengeance, of fortresses and crusades. But Russ spoke only of silence. He had no vision for the Imperium, no desire to shape its future. His task was done. He had executed as commanded, and now he lingered only as a reminder of what loyalty cost. Even in the councils of victory, his voice carried the tone of inevitability. Where others dreamed, Russ growled. Where others argued, he drank. He was no builder. He was the blade that had been used, and now he waited only to be sheathed. The wolves themselves suffered under this weight. Their brothers in arms regarded them not as heroes of Terra, but as kinslayers, the ones who had burned Prospero and carried out the darkest of the Emperor's orders. They were shunned, their howls echoing in halls that grew emptier with every passing year. The wolves answered mistrust with ferocity, becoming more insular, more violent, more loyal only to Fenris and their lord. They called themselves the Vulca Fenrica, the wolves of Fenris, but in truth they were more ghost than legion, a reminder of the age when the Emperor's wrath still walked in flesh. Russ saw what the Imperium was becoming, and in his silence he judged it. The dream of unity was dead. What remained was survival, enforced by cruelty, built upon endless sacrifice. He had played his part in this death. He had carried out the executions that proved loyalty had no meaning but obedience. And now, as the Imperium reshaped itself, he saw his role fading. Not because it was no longer needed, but because it was no longer unique. The Imperium itself had become the executioner. Its armies, its inquisitions, its endless decrees, all of it bore the same truth that had defined him. Mercy was gone. Fear remained. And Russ, the Wolf King, was no longer the exception. He was the template. This realization cut deeper than any wound Horus had given him. For Russ understood that he was not special. He was not unique among his brothers. He was merely the first, the prototype of what the Imperium would become in its entirety. Every soldier, every commissar, every servant of the throne would now play his role. They would all become executioners. The galaxy would be ruled not by brotherhood or hope, but by the inevitability of death for those who faltered. In that truth, Russ saw his own obsolescence, and yet, like all weapons, he would remain until he was broken. The skalds of Fenris tell of his brooding silence in those years, of his long nights staring into the fires, of his rare bursts of rage when mead halls fell silent beneath his growls. They tell of his wolves waiting, always waiting, for the next command that never came. They tell of their lord's growing distance, as if his eyes were fixed upon something none of them could see. For Russ knew, though he did not speak it aloud, that his time in the Emperor's service was nearly ended. Not because he had failed, but because he had succeeded too well. The Imperium no longer needed a single executioner. It had become one. And still, he remained loyal. Broken, scarred, obsolete, but loyal. For loyalty was not a choice for Leman Russ. It was his very existence. To betray it would be to unmake himself. And so, even as he watched the Imperium decay into cruelty, even as he saw his brothers scattered or lost, even as he felt his wolves wither under the weight of mistrust, Russ endured. He drank, he hunted, he obeyed, for he was the Wolf King, and the executioner never puts down his blade until commanded. That concludes Part 7, approximately 1,080 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 8, where we move into the twilight of Russ's tale, his final feast with his wolves, and the haunting disappearance that left only prophecy and silence in his wake? The years after the heresy were a twilight age for Leman Russ. His body still bore the scars from Horus's blow, his mind the weight of Prospero's ashes, and his soul the burden of obedience that had carved him hollow. He no longer sought war as once he had. He no longer roared with laughter in the feast halls of Fenris. Instead, he lingered like a shadow in his own legend, a king without a kingdom, a wolf whose prey had already been devoured. The Imperium was no longer a dream of unity, but a wounded beast tearing at itself to survive, and Russ saw that it had become what he always was. The entire Imperium had become an executioner, and there was no place left for him in such a world. His wolves, loyal as ever, remained at his side. They followed him into smaller wars, into campaigns waged in the ashes of rebellion, but even they could sense the change. Their lord no longer fought with the same fire. His blade struck as true as ever. His voice still carried the weight of command, but the hunger that had once driven him was gone. Russ did not hunt because he desired the kill. He hunted because he had nothing else left, and his wolves, though they obeyed, felt the hollowness creeping into their own hearts. For if their lord was fading, what hope had they to endure? The Imperium, for its part, treated the wolves with suspicion bordering on contempt. They were no longer simply feared, they were distrusted at every turn. Guilliman's reforms, Dorn's fortresses, the political machinery that grew from the corpse of the Great Crusade, all of it pushed the wolves aside. They were regarded as relics of an age too savage, too bloodied, too dangerous to be trusted in the fragile rebuilding. Russ attended the councils of war when required, but his words were brief, his counsel sharp, his presence unsettling. He was not a builder, and the Imperium wanted builders. He was not a lawgiver, and the Imperium wanted laws. He was the executioner, and though the Imperium now wore that title in truth, it wished to forget the first hand that had wielded the blade. So Russ withdrew. He returned to Fenris more often, retreating to the halls of his fortress to drink among his own kind. He sat upon his throne of carved bone and black stone, his eyes distant, his words fewer. His wolves feasted around him, their voices loud with mead-soaked songs. But Russ was not the loudest among them anymore. He was silent, a figure brooding beneath the weight of something greater than even his wolves could understand. He spoke little of the Imperium, less still of the Emperor. He gave no speeches, no grand declarations. Yet in his silence there was more truth than in all the words of his brothers, who still clung to fragile dreams of order. For Russ knew that the age of Primarchs was ending. Their roles were played, their scars permanent. The galaxy would go on, but not with them. Then came the final feast. The sagas tell that Russ summoned his most loyal Jarls, the fiercest of his sons, to a great hall upon Fenris. The fires roared high, mead flowed like rivers, and the wolves drank as though to drown the memory of all they had lost. Russ sat at the head of the hall, his cup heavy in his hand, his eyes reflecting the flames. For one night, he laughed again, his voice booming across the stone walls. For one night, he hunted stories with his wolves, recounting battles and victories, remembering brothers both living and dead. For one night, the Wolf King returned, and his sons rejoiced. But beneath the laughter lay the weight of finality. They all felt it, though none dared speak it aloud. This was not simply a feast, it was farewell. When the dawn came, Russ was gone. No servant saw him leave, no warrior heard his steps. One moment he sat among them, the next he was absent, his throne empty, his cup cold. The wolves searched Fenris, scoured their fortress, questioned every soul, but none could say where their lord had gone. Some whispered he had returned to Terra to kneel once more at the foot of the golden throne. Others claimed he had stalked into the wilderness of Fenris to hunt alone until the end of days. And some, more fearful, said that the warp had claimed him, dragging him into its depths as it had so many of their kin. But none of these answers satisfied. The truth was simpler and darker. Leman Russ had left because his role was complete. The executioner had no place in the Imperium's new age, and so he vanished, as silently as a predator retreating into the snow after the kill. In his absence, he left only prophecy. To his Jarls, he had spoken in fragments, in words half hidden by mead and silence. He had told them he would return at the end of time, at the final battle, when the wolves of Fenris would howl their last and the galaxy would drown in its own blood. He promised he would come again when the Imperium needed him most, not as king, not as brother, but as hunter, to bring the final execution upon the enemies of man. The wolves clung to this prophecy as a starving man clings to bone, repeating it across generations, weaving it into their sagas. Yet prophecy is a cruel comfort, for in every age since, the wolves have howled into the void, waiting for their king, and still he does not return. The Imperium remembers him poorly. To the bureaucrats and lords of Terra, he is a relic of barbarism, a savage primarch whose absence was a blessing. To the Inquisition, he is a dangerous legend, his prophecy a threat that stirs unrest among his descendants. To the historians who dare whisper the truth, he is the Emperor's executioner, the one who proved that loyalty is only another word for sanctioned murder. But to the wolves of Fenris, he is still their king, still their lord, still the shadow in the snow that promises to return. They feast in his name. They howl into the void. They tell the tales of the Wolf King who will return for the final hunt. And though they know deep down that silence is the only answer they will ever receive, they cling to the hope that their Lord still watches from beyond the stars. Haunting reflection spread across the Imperium. Perhaps Russ's disappearance was not abandonment, but punishment. Perhaps he saw too clearly the truth of what the Emperor had built and could no longer bear to serve it. Perhaps his loyalty, so unflinching, had finally broken beneath the weight of what it demanded. Or perhaps, most chilling of all, he waits in silence not to save the Imperium, but to end it. For when the executioner returns, it will not be for mercy, it will be for the final kill. That concludes Part 8, approximately 1,100 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 9, carrying forward into the legacy of Russ's disappearance, the fate of the space wolves in his absence, and the enduring shadow of the executioner's role in the Imperium's grim future? After Russ vanished, the wolves of Fenris stood alone. Their king was gone, their purpose unfinished, their prophecy uncertain. The Jarls gathered in silence, their mead untouched, their songs muted. In every hall, in every hunt, there lingered the absence of the Wolf King, heavier than the howling storms outside. Yet even in his absence, Russ's will bound them. They did not fracture as others did. They did not fall into despair, nor abandon their oaths. For Russ had shaped them too well. They were predators, bound by pack, bound by duty. And though their lord had vanished into silence, The wolves obeyed the last truth he had given them. Endure, wait, and be ready for the final hunt. The Imperium expected them to break. Many in Terra's halls whispered that without their Primarch, the wolves would descend into madness, their savagery turning upon themselves, their fangs tearing one another apart. But this did not come to pass. The wolves endured. They continued to fight, to hunt, to carry out the grim duties the Imperium demanded. Yet their role shifted. No longer the Emperor's chosen sanction, no longer wielded directly by Russ's hand, they became something even darker, the living shadow of their absent king. Every world that saw them remembered the Wolf King's fate, remembered that even the most loyal son had vanished into silence. Every howl in battle was not only a cry of war, but a reminder that the executioner had not been destroyed. He had only stepped away. The wolves themselves carried the burden of his absence with feral pride. They swore that their lord still lived, that he would return at the end of days, that their howls would summon him from whatever place he now walked. They drank to his name. They carved his visage into stone. They sang of his deeds in sagas that grew ever darker with time. But even as they clung to his prophecy, they felt the truth gnawing at them. The Imperium did not believe in Russ's return. The Imperium did not want him back, for the Imperium itself had become the executioner, and in that transformation, Russ was no longer needed. His shadow was enough. The centuries that followed deepened this truth. The wolves were tolerated but never embraced, feared but never trusted. They were unleashed in times of dire need, their savagery a tool the Imperium could not replace, but they were watched with suspicion at every turn. Inquisitors muttered of their independence, of their reliance on Fenris, of their refusal to bow entirely to Terra's decrees. Other chapters regarded them as half-beasts, closer to their feral origin than to the dream of the Codex Astartes. Guilliman's reforms had little purchase among them, for they cared nothing for sterile numbers and careful divisions. They obeyed only the will of their king, and though he was absent, his word still ruled them. They were a chapter of ghosts, haunted not only by Russ, but by their own memory of what they had done at Prospero. For no matter how many victories they carved, the whispers never ceased. Kinslayers, executioners, beasts, and yet the wolves endured. They endured because endurance was all they had ever known. They endured because Fenris itself was a crucible, and no son of that world could imagine surrender. They endured because Russ had shaped them in his own image, unbreakable, inevitable, bound to obedience even when obedience hollowed them out. In battle, they still howled as their lord had taught them, still tore through enemies with fang and fury, still made the galaxy tremble at their coming. They fought not for glory, not for hope, but because it was all they knew. And though their king was gone, they never doubted his return. For to doubt was to betray, and the wolves of Fenris would never betray their lord. But the truth of Russ's disappearance haunted them as much as it sustained them. No message came from Terra to explain his fate. No vision from the Emperor confirmed his destiny. No sign broke the silence. The wolves waited, generation after generation, their sagas repeating the promise of his return, their eyes fixed on the horizon for a dawn that never came. And in the silence of that waiting, doubt crept like frost upon stone. Some whispered that Russ was dead, slain by his wounds, his body hidden by loyal wolves too ashamed to reveal it. Others whispered that he had walked willingly into the warp, not as prey, but as hunter, and that he now stalked demons in an endless hunt beyond mortal sight. Others, more fearful still, said that he had abandoned them, that the weight of obedience had broken even the Wolf King, leaving them to rot in the Imperium's decay. The Imperium itself used his absence as a weapon. The Inquisition scorned the wolves, reminding them that their lord was gone, that their prophecy was delusion. The Administratum used it as proof that all Primarchs were flawed, that no son of the Emperor could be trusted, that only bureaucracy and decrees could rule mankind now. And the Ecclesiarchy twisted it further, declaring that Russ's disappearance was punishment for his arrogance, that he had been cast into the void for daring to claim loyalty without worship. Each voice, each lie, was another attempt to erode the wolves' faith. Yet still, they endured. They endured because they could not do otherwise. To the wolves of Fenris, Russ's disappearance was not abandonment. It was a trial. They were hunters left in the wild without their pack, leader, tested to see if they could survive until his return. And so they howled louder, fought harder, drank deeper. Every battle became not just a war for the Imperium, but a war for Russ's prophecy. Every victory was another sign that they were worthy to stand when he came again. Every death was another verse in the saga of waiting. They did not crumble. They sharpened themselves against the silence until their howls shook the stars. Haunting reflection spread across the Imperium. Perhaps Russ's disappearance was not absence, but presence in another form. Perhaps the Wolf King had not left his sons at all, but had become the silence that bound them, the shadow that shaped them. Perhaps every howl they loosed into the void was answered, not with sound, but with the cold certainty that he still listened. And perhaps the cruelest truth of all was that he would never return, for his role had already been fulfilled. He had shown the Imperium what it truly was. He had executed his brothers, executed the dream of unity, executed the lie of loyalty. The rest was only waiting. And so the wolves waited, hunted, endured. Not because Russ would return, but because they could not stop, for they were the executioner's sons, and silence itself had become their lord. That concludes Part 9, approximately 1,080 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 10, the final part, where we close with the lasting legacy of Leman Russ, the eternal shadow of the executioner, and a fatalistic conclusion that seals his story in haunting silence? Leman Russ has been gone for 10 millennia, and still his shadow hangs heavy upon the galaxy. The wolves of Fenris howl his name into the void, their voices carried across battlefields drenched in the blood of man and alien alike. They wait, as he commanded, for the final hunt, for the day when he will return at the end of all things. Yet the Imperium does not wait. The Imperium endures, rots, and devours itself, just as Russ always knew it would. And in that endless decay, the Wolf King's role lingers, not as a living presence, but as a truth that cannot be silenced. The Emperor's executioner may be gone, but the Imperium itself has inherited his mantle. Every decree, every purge, every silence enforced by fear is proof that his blade was never truly put away. It has simply been broken into 1,000 smaller hands, cutting endlessly. The wolves themselves remain both feared and mistrusted. They are not remembered as saviors, but as beasts barely restrained, their loyalty still doubted, their ferocity still whispered of in dread. Other chapters see them as relics, an echo of an age when obedience was enforced with fang and fire. The Inquisition eyes them with suspicion. The Ecclesiarchy condemns their sagas as heresy, and Terra remembers them only as kinslayers, the butchers of Prospero. Yet despite this, The wolves endure, for they have no choice. They endure because Russ forged them. To endure, to hunt in silence even when the world turns against them, to obey even when obedience damns them. They endure because endurance is all they have ever known, but their endurance is hollow without the Wolf King. Every feast is an echo of that final night, every hunt a rehearsal for a battle that has never come. They sing his sagas, they drink his name, they carve his face into stone, but none of it fills the silence he left behind. His prophecy is repeated, generation after generation, but each repetition is thinner, more fragile, stretched across centuries of absence. They say he will return at the final battle, that he will lead them in the last hunt against the enemies of man. They say he waits in silence, sharpening his claws for the end of days. But the truth, as it always has been, is crueler. The truth is that Russ is gone, and silence is the only answer his wolves will ever hear. For perhaps his prophecy was never a promise, but a curse. Perhaps he told them of his return, not to comfort them, but to bind them, to ensure they would never falter, never abandon their obedience. Perhaps the Wolf King knew that the only way to keep his sons loyal was to give them a hope that would never come true. And so he left them with a dream, knowing it would chain them more tightly than any command. In this way, Russ ensured that even in his absence, his wolves would never stop hunting. They would never stop obeying. They would never stop waiting. And waiting is its own execution. The Imperium itself has no need of Russ's return. It has perfected what he embodied. It has become a realm ruled by fear, where loyalty is measured in silence, where obedience is enforced through slaughter. It is no longer a dream of unity, but a machine of execution grinding endlessly through the centuries. The Inquisition carries his role, purging without mercy. The commissars carry his role, enforcing loyalty with the bolt pistol. The Space Marines themselves carry his role, cast not as heroes, but as predators unleashed against humanity's own kind, as often as against Xenos. The Imperium no longer needs the Wolf King, because it has become the Wolf King. And in that transformation, Russ's legacy is eternal. What then is left of Leman Russ? Not the man, not the brother, not even the Primarch. What remains is the truth he embodied, the truth the Imperium has embraced, that loyalty is not love, but silence, that duty is not service, but execution, that obedience is not glory, but death. Russ lived these truths until they hollowed him, until they drove him to vanish into silence, and now they live on without him, echoed in every act of cruelty committed in the Emperor's name. The executioner does not need to return, for his blade has already fallen upon the galaxy. It will never be lifted again. Yet still, the wolves howl. Still, they cry into the void for their king. Still, they cling to the prophecy of his return. Perhaps they do so because they cannot imagine themselves without him. Perhaps they do so because to admit he will never return is to admit that their role was always meaningless, that they were not his sons, but his tools, discarded when they were no longer needed. Perhaps they do so because hope, even false hope, is the only thing that keeps them from breaking beneath the silence. Their howls echo into the cold void, unanswered, and perhaps that is the final cruelty of Leman Russ's fate. He is remembered not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a silence that binds his sons to obedience even in his absence. Haunting reflection spreads like a wound that never heals. The Wolf King's greatest execution was not of Prospero, nor of Horus's prey, nor of the traitor worlds he scoured in fire. His greatest execution was of hope itself. He killed the illusion that loyalty could be anything but death. He proved that brothers were never safe from one another, that duty always demanded blood, that obedience was indistinguishable from damnation. He executed the dream of the Great Crusade. He executed the dream of unity. He executed the lie that humanity could ever be free. And in that execution, he left behind a galaxy ruled by silence, fear, and cruelty. A galaxy that has carried his role forward for 10,000 years. Leman Russ, the Emperor's executioner, is gone. Perhaps he hunts still in the warp, tearing at demons in an endless hunt. Perhaps he waits at the edge of time, sharpening his claws for the last battle. Or perhaps he is nothing but dust and silence, his prophecy a chain forged of lies. It does not matter, for his shadow remains. His wolves endure, the Imperium endures, and the truth he embodied cannot be killed. The executioner may have vanished, but his work has not. His blade has cut too deep. It will never be undone. And so the saga of Leman Russ does not end with his death, nor with his return. It ends with silence. It ends with the howl of wolves fading into the void, unanswered, as the galaxy devours itself in obedience and cruelty. It ends with the Imperium itself standing as his eternal reflection, the final proof of what he was, the Emperor's executioner, the hand that struck down kin. The shadow that proved loyalty is only another word for death. This is the legacy of Leman Russ, and it is eternal.